Hey everyone, and thank you so much for listening to the Facilities in Focus podcast. My name is Mackenna Moralez, and I'm the Associate Editor of FacilitiesNet and your host. Some of you may actually know our guest today because it's Greg Christensen, the host of CMMS Radio, a podcast about all things CMMS. Greg is a consultant who draws on over 30 years of experience in facilities management. If you have a CMMS project and want some insights, please connect with Greg and subscribe to CMMS Radio after subscribing to Facilities in Focus, of course. But you can subscribe to him on all streaming services, like his or follow his page on Instagram. He's passionate about all things facilities management and loves to help solve problems. But thank you so much for being here today, Greg. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's awesome to be here with you. And I always look forward to just normal, natural conversations like this. And yeah, you're right. If people want to hook up, it's CMMS Radio company page on LinkedIn is the best spot.
Perfect. Well, I know that CMS is like your bread and butter. We're not talking about that today. We're going to be talking about IoT. So, can you just like explain to me a little bit about what that is and how it is affecting facilities management right now?
Well, so IoT, Internet of Things, you'll sometimes
Right.
hear the term IIoT, which is the industrial Internet of Things, is all about this concept of a connected environment where we're leveraging technologies, cloud-based technologies, sensors, things of that nature to
Right.
gather data, gain some insights. And when it comes to facilities management, there's a couple of areas that come to mind. Now, first of all, I'm not an expert on IoT, but I've been around it for a lot of years, and I tend to, in these scenarios, call a friend when I
Right.
want to get some real expert guidance, because I don't want to make things up that lead people astray. But I will tell you, from a facilities management perspective, some of the kind of advantages when you're looking at and you're ready for leveraging IoT technologies. It's about creating visibility to what's happening throughout your facility within that building envelope. It might be external, but with sensor monitoring and other data sets that can provide you clues and either real time or near real time information about what's happening with building systems or sometimes building areas. Typically, I think of in facilities management the assets that we're concerned with. We want them running, and we need information about how they're running, when they're about to potentially fail or maybe change in the way that they function. The biggest one for me is the HVAC systems. When we
Mhm.
talk about heating and air conditioning, particularly, one of the things that happens with these types of pieces of equipment is they run hard when it's hot. If it's heating, they're running hard when it's cold, and we need to see, track, and kind of manage what's happening with that piece of equipment so that it doesn't fail at an inopportune time, or it doesn't have to be, say, for example, taken down or shut down for maybe some maintenance. So leveraging things like sensors can give you some insights as to how it's running. Maybe that's going to be based on temperature thresholds, or maybe it's running hours. And that's generally where these technologies can be leveraged in facilities management to, sometimes we might say, level up, but more so it's to create more awareness of what's actually happening. And then that's going to lead us into some of the other things in the conversation, like what are you really doing with that technology as a facilities manager? But generally speaking, I hope that helps answer the question.
But then it just posed the question, what are facility managers actually doing with this technology? Because I know our listeners are probably sick of me saying this bit of information, but I previously wrote for the supply chain. So when I first got acquainted with IoT, it was from a supply chain and logistics standpoint. And it was just using IoT to know where your stuff was, basically. And how are facility managers using this technology?
Well, I would say with whatever systems they have in place, right, to track daily event occurrence, right? Maybe disruptions, repairs, unexpected repairs, or to see and track how assets are performing, that's how they're going to leverage that technology. And I always use that HVAC as an example because everybody can typically relate to that. It can be
Right.
other building systems, it can be elevators, and uh, obviously with supply chain, you can do the same thing. But in FM in particular, it tends to be about how can I be in more places than where I am right now? If
Mhm.
I'm a facilities manager, part of my role is to keep the facility running well, safely. And to do that, I need information at all times. Now,
Right.
the rub with that information is you want contextual information. You just don't want tons and tons of data that you don't know what to do with. So it has to be contextualized. But this is where facilities management can leverage all these technologies in IoT to get an actual picture of what's happening now, what might be coming in the way of necessary work, things that we need to get on schedule. Sometimes you can leverage preventive maintenance information with your IoT so that you can see who's coming on site to do what schedule was it based on, is it based on cycle counts, hours of operation, et cetera. And I already mentioned the condition of that asset, because in IoT for me, it's a lot of it's going to be about condition monitoring and sensor integration, because you can
Mhm.
leverage that cloud-based data to get these clues as they're constantly happening. Again, we have to be careful when it comes to this idea that using IoT, using sensors or anything like it, any software, it's not a magic silver bullet. It's not an easy button that's just going to do things for you. You still have to manage it, but you have to leverage contextual data that gives you the right clues about what's happening with those pieces of equipment or conditions of facilities themselves.
Right. Do you ever think that we might be getting too reliant on technology or just we're too connected?
I do, and that's the double-edged sword kind of when it comes to technology, where we can leverage it and leverage it properly if we have good people and process in place already. So
Right.
when you're moving fundamentally well without technologies and then you bring in technology, now you're amplifying that, so to speak. You're creating other opportunities to continually improve. But you make an interesting point with that question when it comes to this idea of kind of languidity or laziness. If we become too reliant or we fall into habits of set it and forget it. And
Right.
that is not a thing. It really
Mhm.
is not a thing. As much as we want it, it's really a poor practice, and we can get lulled into it when
Right.
we become too reliant. So I think we are somewhat too reliant on technology, and it diminishes our ability to think critically. Now, this isn't everywhere. I'm not saying don't use technology. I'm saying when you use it, you have to remember and make a practice of revisiting what that technology is doing. Meaning, is it doing what it was supposed to do? Are we scrutinizing the data that's coming from these technologies? Or are we just getting the technology and then getting back to this other work of firefighting and being reactive? Because ultimately, the reason we want to use data of any kind and technologies like this is so that not only do we see what's happening, see what's not happening, get an opportunity to intervene, but we want to become less and less reactive and more proactive. I
Right.
think the big concern is we get our technologies, and when I say we, I'm just generalizing, putting everybody together. We get our technologies, and then we think, oh, we're all good now. That's where you have to make a really good practice of keeping an eye on your
Mhm.
technology, making sure that it's working, making sure that it meets the needs of your teams and how they already move.
A common thing that we have discussed this season is that you just can't set it and forget it in facilities management. That is not a thing that is possible in this industry. But also that technology should just be a tool in your tool belt. You shouldn't become reliant on it. But my fear when it comes to technology and as people start to use AI more and have more capabilities and just all this tracking is that you're going to get burnt out in a different level that you might not be used to. Like, obviously, there's the physical and the mental burnout, but just having all this information given to you at any time, all day long, is a little overwhelming. And it reminds me of when, because I have a baby, he's 14 months old, when we were leaving the NICU, I asked, like, is there anything that I need? Is there anything that I could possibly be forgetting? As like a new parent, you want to know everything. And the neonatologist told us not to get the outlet sock. Do you know what that is?
Mm-mm.
It's a sensor that you put on the baby's foot so that it tracks their breathing while they're sleeping.
Mm-mm.
And it there's no studies that show that it reduces the risk of SIDS or anything like that. All it does is a lot of parents feel calmed by it, but for someone like me who is incredibly anxious, it just would have caused more anxiety. If just like you, this is an audio medium, Greg, but just constantly checking it, constantly getting that information that might not have been good for my own well-being at all.
Yeah.
And sometimes I get worried that's where we're headed towards when it comes to technology.
You make a really good point, and I think we were kind of trying to get to that exact point in your questioning, where the technology, as great as it is, we can start to not only become reliant on it, but it can pull you into the, I almost want to say the wrong behaviors, but I think what I mean is behaviors that are slightly off track and often unnecessary,
Or
where,
unhealthy.
yeah, unhealthy, like an incessant kind of a thing where you're constantly monitoring and it's taking you away from what you actually could be doing. I almost want to say should be doing. And
Mhm.
with that app that you're talking about, I can see how that could become a thing. We see it with other technologies, right? And this is really interesting when it comes to IoT. It
Right.
can be very powerful, create insights, create awareness, but you could get kind of pulled into this vortex of data, 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 data. I got to check, I
Right.
got to check, I got to check, I got to check. And that can be too much. I think you make a really good point there where the technology could almost become invasive and change your priorities without you even knowing it.
Right. And especially when technology, like we said, is supposed to be a tool. It's supposed to aid you in doing things so that you can focus on the more important things. But if it keeps on pulling you away to the computer, are you really getting what you need from it?
Yeah, that's another one that we see with all of these technologies when it comes to, well, let's talk about it, the maintenance teams, the
Mhm.
frontline workers. And the idea this is kind of one of these, maybe it's a public service announcement when it comes to bringing in technologies for your maintenance teams. Do not leave them out of that decision making process, or at least allow them to contribute in some way that informs how they work, because one of the common issues and one of the common dangers when you bring in technologies like this is forcing it on teams that will already oftentimes tell you they're busy doing their work that actually needs to get done, and the
Right.
technology can disrupt that process, because the minutes that they have to take to keep up with the technology pulls them off of their primary task, the good work that they're there to do in the first place. And I want to be careful not to just crush anybody out there. You need these technologies in some way, shape, or form, but make sure that you need them and that they're going to be effective first, rather than
Right.
trying to make a process that's already in place that works without the technology. You don't want to disrupt that. You want to make sure that it
Right.
really meets the need. Hopefully that kind of resonates.
Yeah, you don't want to make it more cumbersome when they were doing just fine. Like, what if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
Basically. I know this sounds kind of silly, but do you think it would be worthwhile if somebody was looking to implement IoT within their facilities team? would it be worthwhile for them to just like take a vote with their team members and see if it would be helpful for them or what they would hope to get out of it?
Well, I think you can make it helpful. So it would be an interesting exercise to take that vote, but then use the results of that vote
Yeah.
to then ask more questions, because this is the number one thing. Well, number one, debatable, but here's one thing that makes a real impact on technology adoption
Mhm.
and whether you really are going to benefit from it. You may or may not need it, but whether you're really going to benefit from it is the involvement of that team and understanding where they're at. So this reminds me of the concept of getting out there with your people rather than staying behind, the computer at your desk.
Right.
Just, hey, I need these KPIs. Hey, I need this stuff done. I need to see, track, and manage all this. Well, that has to have value for your team. And it's not just a what's in it for me type of thing. It's also, why are we really doing this? So I kind of like the idea of taking a vote. My questioning on it, though, my hesitation is, when do we ask for that vote? Do we do it before we're going to jump into a project, or do we set it up with some context and tell our team, hey, we're looking at this, we're going to bring in technology, and we think it's going to do this, 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 and that. What do you all think?
Right.
Or
Or
do
even
you
just
do it
like
the other way
what
around?
helps you? What would help
Yeah,
you the most?
yeah. That that right there is more of a leadership thing. Is how can I find out what my team really needs? Because that's my real job, is to give them what they need. So rather than top down, maybe it's the other way around. So I'm kind of intrigued by this idea you
Mhm.
brought up about just putting it to a vote right away, because it's pretty real. I love real.
Right. And I think oftentimes when people get to like a manager position or a director position, they forget what it's like to be on the floor working or doing the stuff. So what could be beneficial to to like you as a manager is not going to be helpful to the people that are on the floor
Yeah,
working. So to actually get their input on it, I think that would make a world of a difference.
it does.
Mm.
It really does. And it also tells your team members that you're there, that you're paying attention. And it's not just about valuing their inputs, but that effort to understand them
Mhm.
from where they do their work, getting out there, doing facility walks, checking in with people instead of just calling them to your office. It makes an impact, whether you realize it or not, as a leader, as a manager, as a supervisor, even team leads. Being in the mix sends
Mhm.
a message. And
Right.
but you can't just do it like, I showed up for 3 minutes, I'm out of here, I got to get back to work. You got to really be in there and listen, pay attention, ask questions. And when you ask questions, just listen. Sometimes you don't even have to do that. You can just hang around, go to the break room when everybody's on break, hang around.
Hey, you'll hear people complain.
or or you'll hear people talk about how they solved a problem. And
That's
that's
true.
when it's good to take notice and say, oh, I heard you guys talking about that. Can you tell me more? I've always wanted to
Mhm.
know more about that, what it's like for you.
Right. Oh, that's such a positive spin to
Yeah.
it. But speaking of problem solving, what are some common challenges that a manager may face that IoT could help with?
Well, that one that I brought up when it comes to how can I be in two places at once, that that that's kind of what I'm thinking. So I did a facility tour somewhat recently, call it a site visit, and it was a pretty large facility. We're talking, so think about 1 million square feet. Now you can adapt this kind of story and analogy or whatever you want to call it into pretty much any size facility. But when you have to cover that much ground to know and understand what's happening in your facility, that tells you where you can start to leverage these technologies to, in a sense, be in more than one place at one time. You're not really
Mhm.
physically replicating yourself. What you're doing is you're creating kind of a version of what your facility is that you can see, without having to go cover that 1,000,000 square feet or that 50,000 square foot facility. And I think that's really one of the challenges. The other challenge is the visibility into this concept of what has been happening or what's not happening that's causing us problems. So
Right.
leveraging IoT creates that. You'll hear, a lot of buzzy stuff, single pane of glass, single source of truth, everything all in one place. It's at your fingertips. Well,
Mhm.
that's kind of true, but it's also, you got to be careful with that because we're talking about a lot of information all in one place. So
Right.
it's not necessarily what it seems to be. That's why you got to make sure the deployments are done properly and that you're getting this technology for the right reasons. But the main challenge is being able to gather and collect the right kind of data, contextual data around what you already do as a facilities manager and what's happening with your facilities teams and how that impacts your organization and all the different people that use that facility for one thing or another. It doesn't matter if it's a health club, it could be a manufacturing facility, all these different types of facilities, hospitals, you name it, right? Anything facilities management. You want that data that allows you to make data driven decisions. But the maturity of your organization is going to be a factor as to how well you can adopt that technology. But I do really simplify it and say, hey, how can I be in more places than just where I'm sitting right now? And how
Right.
can I actually see, track, and manage the people, the things, and all of it related to this facility? That's kind of rolling up the challenges in a
Mhm.
nutshell. Maybe it's a little bit less specific though.
I do think one of the best parts about IoT is the transparency of it all, and that when people have a question, you are able to exactly pinpoint it. And for so long, that hasn't been the case. And now we're able to do that.
We are, and that's the rub is you got to have proper adoption, constant participation. And I go back to one little bit of, I don't know if it's guidance, you call it whatever you want, but when it comes to leaders and managers that are bringing in these technologies and expecting their teams to use them so that they can get all this great data, you've got to stay in on that as well. You can't
Mhm.
start asking people for stuff that they've put in the system or that our IoT technologies already have. Don't go run and grab your team lead and ask him a question that you could have pulled up on whatever system you have, in a couple of seconds. Because once they start to experience that, they'll tune out. They'll stop using the technologies and they won't care either.
Right. But also with all this technology that we're gaining and we're becoming reliant on, I feel like that is also trouble for cyber security, especially in the implementation process.
Ooh, yeah.
Um, and I feel like it's been on everybody's mind because just it seems like in the most recent weeks, there has been so many cyber attacks. Ascension was down for weeks last year. And how can managers be more cognizant of their security practices when implementing these technological solutions?
It's a big question. That's like an entire series rather than an episode, right? So, generally speaking, and I'm no expert when it comes to internet security or any of that. I have people that I can talk to about that. I always make this joke about, hey, I phone a friend, and
Right.
what we need is true expert guidance. And sometimes you line up 10 experts, you get 10 different answers. I think these challenges with security, cybersecurity, they're only going to get more and more challenging. And
Mhm.
I think first off, when it comes to facilities management, maybe it's necessary to first assess what data are we really putting into these solutions
Right.
and how critical is it if it were to get out. Now, I don't know the answer to that. So in my world, we used to talk about security back when I was selling solutions, which I don't really
Mhm.
do anymore. There was concern about sensitivity. What's the data security on the platform now? I'm going back even a few years or so, right? Let's say 5
Right.
years.
Right.
And it's very different now. The vulnerabilities are way greater than they were even 5 years ago. It seems to change month by month, maybe even sooner. So I think first you got to scrutinize what data is going into these platforms, and if you have any control at that point, maybe not putting in sensitive data. On the other hand, when it comes to the overall security protocols, I think you need to bring in organizations that have a strong reputation for understanding the security, not based on what they advertise, but based on what you can find in your peer groups that
Mhm.
are in similar situations. Maybe maybe talking to those people in your peer group that are in the same industry as you are, that have dealt with these issues, to find out who's the most trusted advisor that actually understands these things, that can tell you what you should and shouldn't do when it comes to security. I hope that
Right.
answers the question. It's a big question.
I'm so sorry. I feel like I'm just worried all the time. All the time about like data leaks and like I try not to have my personal information out there, but like you can't do anything without having to download an app lately. Maybe that's like my boomer complaint is that I always have to download an app and I'm kind of sick of it because
Yeah,
I don't want my information on everything.
that's it's an interesting one, and I have one particular individual that I always like to talk to about this, and you have to be very mindful about your information. And I think in a lot of cases, I think that ship has partially sailed. It's it's so bad, how much info and data that we really put out there, and we don't even realize it because we're kind of sucked into this alternate reality of the internet and social media.
Right.
So
It's so
it's kind of,
normalized now. Like I can unlock my phone with my phone print or with my thumbprint. I have an Android, you guys. I am not on the iPhone game yet, but I can do it with my thumbprint. While iPhones, you can scan it with your face, and it is just why do you need all of that?
yeah, it's a tough one. Well, then organizationally speaking, it's the
Mhm.
same concerns, and it's not even necessarily the data that you're putting into the system. It's also the opportunities that these solutions create for, cracks in the system. Now we've got this
Mhm.
other system that we're using, our IoT technology for our facilities maintenance, operations, all of this. Well, now we've got to deal with data integrity and system security on other platforms, other cloud versions of,
Right.
access points. I think that's where it starts to really spin out with the security risks and vulnerabilities.
Mhm. And I feel like there's such like a fine line between cybersecurity and what the facilities managers are in charge of. When do you start to hire a technology expert to cover technology stuff and then let the maintenance people do their jobs? And what where's the line in that, do you think?
Well, I think anything with the facilities team,
Mhm.
with the folks doing the work, managing the work, and anywhere in between, I think that has to be really all about the work itself. So when you're getting advisement on the technological side, as it relates to security or what you're about to do, we want to draw some kind of a line based on where the expertise runs out and or no longer applies.
Right.
So I think I'm asking a question instead of answering your question. I'm asking the question, when do our technological advisors have no say in what's about to happen and vice versa? So we want to draw the line somewhere in between effective functionality that's being used in the hands or at the desks of the folks that do all the facilities work or manage all the facilities work, and then as soon as we get into the technical realm, that's all tech.
Right.
I just don't know how to articulate where that line really is, because it tends to be different organization by organization,
Right.
big, small, or somewhere in the
Hmm.
middle. It's it's a pretty tough question to answer.
Do you think
And
that's why more facility managers should embrace technology or even learn how to use this type of tech?
I'll say sometimes I think that's the case, but we also have to look at their functional roles.
Hmm.
There's one viewpoint that I'm kind of, I don't know if fascinated is the right word, but when I look at C-suite versus non-C-suite, the skill sets and what their roles are and what they really do are really different.
Right.
And we make a lot of assumptions that certain roles have to know all these different things, have to truly understand the technology deeply, and that might be a mistake. Almost like
Hmm.
what we were talking about earlier in this discussion, where some of our technologies can take us away from what we're really doing.
Right.
It gets to be kind of a slippery slope, I think, when we look at that. I do think at a base level, it's nice for anyone in facilities to understand some of the technology, while I'm also a big fan of button clicking, meaning I know how to click the
Hmm.
buttons, I know what it does and why we're doing it, but I don't know how it works. I don't know that you have to know how it works. You just have to know that it does work.
Right.
So I'm playing it kind of safe here.
That's fine. I know. Contrary to how this conversation starts, we or sounds, we are pro technology. We
Well, I'm a huge fan of technology, with the caveat that you should be able to do what you do without the technology to then figure out how best to leverage the technology. So don't
right.
forget your basic fundamentals, what actually is being done absent any technology, and then leverage the technology. There are some exceptions where the technology can fix some of your non-technology things, but
Hmm.
that's my big concern. I'm a huge fan of technology. I'm just not a fan of technology for technology's sake, as this thing that does a bunch of work for you. There's some of that, but not much. Not as much as people would think.
Right. Just let it be a tool. Don't let it completely change you. I had this argument with Sean Black when we were talking about AI. I think that episode will have gone live before this one. But
Mm.
he said that a year from now, he thinks that AI is going to completely replace content creation. And as a journalist, I was like, no.
That's a good one. Because there's a lot of indicators that that may be the case. However,
Mhm.
I I certainly don't want that to be the case, and it's not because I want to be eliminated from what I do. It's more so that the risk with technology is that it can, in fact, dumb things down. It can, in fact, become what's real when it's really not. Is it doing the right things? Is it saying the right things? Is it learning the right things? And there's all these different areas of kind of concern. And someone might say, well, what about all the positives and all these great things that it does for us? Well, yeah, good. I love that. I love that stuff. But is it
Mhm.
really doing the right things? So there's a
Right.
lot to be concerned about there.
And that just goes back to what you were saying before about how you can't set it and forget it. You have to check your work, guys. We have to check it.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. I'll use an analogy. I use vehicles a lot of times for analogies, motor
Okay.
vehicles, cars.
Okay.
And we're talking about IoT, and we talk about technology and what it can do for us. So in your vehicles, typically there's going to be some form of a temperature gauge. Now, the
Mhm.
temperature gauge is really nice technology because it can give you some insights very close to leading indicators as to what's about to happen with your vehicle if the
Right.
temperature is getting too hot. But then there's the check engine light.
Mhm.
Most typically, when the check engine light goes off, right, when it's displayed, it's lit up,
Mhm.
You already have a problem.
Right.
So what that does is, for a lot of people, they think they need to check their car from a maintenance perspective, and I'll try to make this make sense to facilities when that light goes off, and that's not the way to do it. Or some of the other more advanced technologies that can tell you, maybe in your vehicle, and this applies to facilities and assets and manufacturing and all this, where oil viscosities might have broken down. Now, it's a little bit of a
Mhm.
stretch, but the whole point of me bringing that up is the technology will constantly put you at risk of being lulled into that set it and forget it mindset. And it's not that you're doing that intentionally. It's
Right.
because it it makes you think, whether you realize it or not, that you're covered.
Mhm.
And technology has that kind of promise of tomorrow where you don't have to do anything. But that is a trick. That is not a thing. It's
Right.
just not a thing. Um, Hopefully that's making sense. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but
No, it does, but I also know that we are running short on time, Greg.
uh-oh.
And I know it doesn't, this conversation really makes us sound anti-technology, but we aren't. So, what advice would you give to a facility manager who is considering an IoT adoption?
Number one, go slowly. It is not a magic silver bullet. However, it is an opportunity. Just verify that that opportunity is going to be effective and impactful for your organization. So you go slowly. Don't be so resistant to the technology that you just say, yeah, no, I'm not going to look at that. Look at it and understand what it's going to do for you, but go slowly. Also, when it comes to engaging with folks that are providing you this technology, do not be afraid. In fact, make it a practice to ask them very difficult, challenging questions. And it's not to jam them up, it's because you need to ask them about what you're concerned about. And you will tend to get a sense when they answer if they're really understanding you, as opposed to just selling you a bunch of sensors, selling you a bunch of technology that's going to be the best thing since sliced bread, any of that kind of stuff. That's a bit of a concern. Be a little bit mindful there, but don't resist the technology. Understand the technology and how it's going to meet your needs and what it's going to do for you to augment what you already do well. Fair?
Mhm. That's totally fair. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Greg. I really appreciate it. You guys, make sure to connect with Greg on LinkedIn, follow CMMS Radio, and subscribe to him on all streaming platforms. But of course, do it after Facilities in Focus, okay? But thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate it.
You got it. I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Facilities in Focus podcast. Facilities in Focus is a product of the facility market which houses FacilitiesNet, building operating management, facilities maintenance decisions, and healthcare facilities today. Thank you to our sound and video editor, Paul Ellertson. Thank you to Morgan Johnson for designing our logo. Thank you to Dan Welton, Dave Lubach, Dan Hounsell, Jeff Warden, Jill McDermott, and everyone else at Trade Press Media Group. For comments, or if you are interested in being a guest on Facilities in Focus, please email us at fnpodcast@tradepress.com.